Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a new edition of True Crime with the Sarge. I'm your host, Joseph Jackalone, and with us tonight, we have a very special guest. We have Captain Joseph Murgo of the East Haven, Connecticut Police Department. Captain, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming on tonight.
Thank you very much for having me. Glad to be here.
Anytime. So tonight is about Patricia Newsome and the cold case. So first of all, she was originally just Jane Doe, right? And she was just identified a few years ago. When I had Colleen Fitzpatrick on, she told me you got to talk to Joe Margot. So here we are tonight. So a lot of people haven't really heard much about Patricia Newsome's case. So I just want to go through some of the basics in the beginning. We were talking offline before. We were talking about just describe East Haven anyway in regards to geography in so what people can actually put a kind of zone in on that.
Sure, yeah. So it's East Haven, Connecticut. It's a 10 square mile town, shoreline town in Connecticut. It runs along the I-95 corridor. So where Patricia Newsome was found was along I-95 in a shopping center. About 29,000 people, hard working town, and in 1975 when this occurred, it really shocked the community because they weren't used to these types of crimes, especially in the manner in which Patricia was found. So yeah, it was a big case at the time.
And I'm assuming it's still a big case, right? Because I mean, this was in the news again in 2023 when she was finally identified. So it kind of brings everything back up.
Yeah, she remained a Jane Doe for 48 years, and in 2023, we were lucky enough, leveraging the power of DNA and modern technology, which finally caught up to be able to identify her. But if you want to back up, we could
Yeah.
talk about how she was found and exactly what the circumstances was surrounding her death, which is very interesting because at the time, people couldn't believe that nobody was coming forward to at least report a missing person.
Right. So yeah, let's go through it. So let's walk us through the crime scene. It happens behind a department store, right? Was it Bradley's department store?
Yeah, yeah. So August 16th, 1975, a truck driver was cutting through the rear of the Bradley's shopping center, which is now a CarMax. It's along I-95 on Frontage Road, and you know, lucky for us or for investigators at the time, the truck driver was also an auxiliary state police officer. So when he was driving through the parking lot, he noticed what he believed to be a human body wrapped in some sort of tarp or some sort of canvas blanket. He made one pass through, saw it, and it was an extremely rainy day that day. So there wasn't too much traffic in the area. He made one pass, saw it, came back, and later saw it again. And it was through, his second pass, which really made him stop and take a closer look. When he got out, he took a look and he saw that the package appeared to have been bound in 3 different areas. One was bound up by the head, on the torso, and then by the feet was. And he decided to call the police, who showed up, moments later. Soon as investigators got to the scene, they were able to saw a hole in the package, and unfortunately, they found human hair. So they knew that, at that moment, that somebody was wrapped up in a tarp. Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty chaotic scene at first, only because again, East Haven is a small town. It borders New Haven, but they weren't used to finding things of this nature, especially the manner in which she was bound. So um, they took her out of the drainage ditch. That's where she was found, floating in it, and they didn't unwrap her or anything on scene, but they transported her to the medical examiner's office, where they were able to get a better, more controlled look at her. Again, because the weather was terrible.
Well, we know this is an ongoing case, so we don't want to, blow anything. So just want everybody know that there are certain questions and certain things we won't be able to talk about. So if you do have a question, we'll try to answer it. But there are some questions that we might not be able to talk about. Now, Was there any other items in the tarp? I know I remember reading on from the newspaper article that there was maybe paint on the tarp, or was there any other kind of evidence that was public, that's public knowledge?
Yeah, so she was bound and gagged in a couple of different ways. She was bound by the wrists, she was bound around the torso, and she was bound around the ankles. She was in a jackknife position, and the knots in which she was tied up were suggestive of somebody who was familiar with knots. They weren't any, you know, esoteric knots. They were, granny hitches, lark's head, half hitches, those types of things. Especially back then when, people were better versed in those types of things. I'm not sure the generation today knows more than to tie their shoes, just a regular bow knot. But back then, um, you know, people were a little more versed in those types of things. So, they sent those knots to the FBI, and they didn't suggest any particular profession or occupation. They were just common knots for the time.
Right,
She
and
was bound with.
I'm sorry, but you guys are near the water, correct? Are you guys far from the
What's
water?
that? I'm
There are
sorry.
boats. Are you guys near the water? And we have boats and stuff like that. Was there
Yeah,
something like?
yeah, no, we are a shoreline community. So again, they were definitely took a look at people with maritime experience. We aren't too far from Groton, where the submarine base is. So no, we're definitely a shoreline community with people who are well versed in boats and those types of things. And that's one of the avenues they went down when they were investigating. She was gagged with a couple of different things. She was also, which was very interesting, she was wrapped about the head and neck with two different trash bags, which was interesting to investigators. It suggested that the killer possibly knew the victim or did not want to look at the victim in her eyes or at her face while he was committing the crime, or didn't want to look at the victim while he was, wrapping her up or discarding her. So the fact that two trash bags, in addition to being wrapped in that tarp, were covering her face and head and neck area. So that was really interesting to him too.
And even back in the '70s, so like the investigators, I mean, we didn't really know anything going on with forensics and stuff like that, but they kept all these things, the knots and the gags and everything that was kept.
Yeah, so it was kept for a while, and that's the part about this case is that not all of the evidence, all of the physical evidence that existed was somehow destroyed,
Yeah.
misplaced, discarded. We're not sure exactly what happened to it, but none of the evidence exists to this day, besides pictures of all of those things. So that's
Right.
a frustrating twist, because later on there were several suspects that emerged. So
Right, but
that stuff would have
welcome
been
to the world
helpful
of
to
cold.
have,
Welcome to the world of cold
once
cases,
these
right?
suspects started coming out of the woodwork.
Especially with cold cases. I mean, all these things are just always something going wrong. How old was the victim when you first saw her?
Yeah, and I guess the interesting part about what was that? The connection. I don't know. The connection is really bad for some reason. Yeah.
Yeah, you froze up there. What? So I was just, how old was the victim when they found her? What was the approximate age that they gave the East Haven Jane Doe?
Um, yep. So they at first they estimated her to be late teens to mid 20s, and once we identified her, they were pretty spot on. She was 2 weeks before her 18th birthday, so she was 17 years old at the time of her death. They estimated that she was in that drainage ditch between 1 to 2 weeks. She was pretty severely decomposed, and obviously the weather and the rain played a factor in the level of decomposition that they found. But they were pretty confident to say that she wasn't in that ditch for any longer than 2 or so weeks. So yeah, she was 2 weeks before her 18th birthday, which is pretty sad.
Yeah, no, and the weather too, because you're talking about August, right? So everything's hot, so everything is amplified by that, especially when it hits decomposition. It just ruins so much evidence.
Yeah, yeah, and so that was pretty much it. She was completely nude. The only thing she wore were two nondescript gold earrings, and able to see that she had a extensive amount of dental work, which was interesting to them because they knew she was young, and back then, dental work, even by today's standards, dental work is extremely expensive. So, um, once they saw the amount of dental work and orthodontic work in her mouth, they were confident that, she came from a family who appeared to have loved her and took care of her. And, they were expecting somebody to reach out at some point soon to report at least a missing person. Um, they also saw, upon further and closer review, that it appeared that she had some kind of rhinoplasty, like a nose job. Not sure if it was cosmetic or if it was due to some sort of injury where they had to reconstruct it. But, those two factors really made investigators think at the time that somebody, mom or dad or some sort of siblings, would be looking for her. So that was their first and most important um, thing that they did at first was try to identify her, was to get this story out into the media, into the news. And there wasn't that 24-hour news cycle like there is now, so they really relied on newspapers and bulletins and reaching out to different jurisdictions to try to see if they may have had any missing persons in the area. Once nobody came forward looking for any missing persons, they sent her dental records to different dentists around the region. And once that didn't work, they sent her dental records around the country, just in case she was, from a different country. We know that the East Coast attracts, up the 95 corridor, Wildwood, all the way up to Connecticut and past. We attract a lot of foreign workers, especially over the summer. So they reached out to a lot of different entities, including the FBI, finally, once nobody came forward.
Right, and part of the problem was that she had some family issues in the beginning, and she was at I guess a boarding home, and she kind of left from that, and that's how this whole thing kind of gets lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, so that was definitely the theory at first. And to be honest, the only reason why we got that information was from the stepmother, whose credibility came into question um, after she was found. So the more we learn about the case, the less we really believe some of the things that we learned early on, which is unfortunate. Um, we know that Patricia came from a military family, and we know that she was born in Idaho, and her father relocated the family to Pennsylvania and then New Jersey. But the unfortunate part was that her mother passed away early on. Her mother passed away like when she was really, really young, and the father remarried. And that's where the stepmother comes into play. But the more we learn about the stepmother, the more toxic of a family environment we start to we start to hear about, So a lot of the theories that we hear about Patricia were presented by the stepmother, and her credibility has definitely come into question. But that's years later. Going back to the 1970s, again, they were interested in identifying her, and not less interested in trying to find out the circumstances surrounding her death, but their train of thought was, we need to figure out who she is first and then work backwards. And it's amazing how time flies, and it's amazing how these investigations start off extremely hot and turn cold, in a matter of months. Patricia was up at the medical examiner's office for 1 year, and in 1976, they released her from the medical examiner's office to the care of the East Haven Memorial Funeral Home. And thank God that funeral home is still in business today, because that's where we started to learn about some of the other clues which really helped us exhume her. So she went to the East Haven Memorial Funeral Home, and they buried her at the State Street Cemetery, which at the time was fully functional, up and running. But years later, it became defunct and abandoned, which was part of the challenge in trying to find her once the decision to exhume her was made.
Right, and this is the reason why Colleen Fitzpatrick says you got to talk to you, because this was all about tenacity. We were talking about this because she had asked me, like, what made you tick? What made you do these things? I said, well, I don't like giving up, right? So then she says, that's you got to talk to Joe. So in 2020, you and your partner, you get promoted to captain by then.
Yeah, so myself and a colleague, Dave Emmerman, we were promoted to captain in 2020. And, just to preface this whole thing, this was a case that haunted the East Haven community for all of these years. In the 70s, it was a huge deal. In the 80s, they were still trying to track down who she was. The local newspapers and the local media followed up constantly about this case, just because it shocked the community so bad. And, when I got on the job in 2003, when you're on FTO, you jump in a car with a veteran, or with a seasoned guy, and he takes you around the town, and he shows you the landmarks, and he shows you the town boundaries, and shows you where the high school is, and all these things. And he brings you back behind the area where Patricia was found, and he goes over that story, because that story was passed down from generation to generation. So as a new guy, we heard about this, never thought in a million years we'd be able to jump into it as actual investigators to try to solve this, or try to identify her. But this is one story that every new guy heard, and myself and Captain Emmerman are no different. So there was a lore behind this investigation. We knew it turned cold. We always intended on, working on it, or hopefully working on it. So I jumped into it in 2020. Captain Emmerman, because of his administrative functions, in 2015 or 16, he jumped into it a little earlier, because we took a lot of the case files and went from, the paper case files, scanned them in digitally, which allowed him to get eyes on it. And he started to see that, investigators worked really hard on it, but it turned cold. And it was interesting to think that technology was the only thing that needed to catch up to be able to do a few things to give us a chance in solving it, right? So APHIS, the fingerprints, we had fingerprints from her, and we knew that APHIS was starting to upload a lot of the fingerprints nationally. So Dave Emmerman took it upon himself to throw her fingerprints in APHIS, never got a hit, but we started to see that technology was catching up, and our ability to solve this thing was probably going to rest on our ability to successfully exhume her. So again, in 2020, we get promoted, which allowed us a little bit more flexibility to be able to pick and choose some of the things we really wanted to focus on. And, we knew right off the bat that this was, the most important investigation that we wanted to jump into. but we had to take a look to see how far previous investigators got. So we pulled out the case file, which is huge. We took a look at some of the efforts, but the one thing we couldn't find was exactly where she was buried. We knew that East Haven Funeral Home was in charge of her burial in 1976, and we were lucky enough to still have close friends and colleagues at that funeral home. So we took a ride there. They went downstairs into the basement and dusted off some of their old record books, and they were able to find the entry in which they buried Jane Doe. The greatest clue we found was that she was buried in a Ziegler casket, which is a non-ornate metal casket. The best way I could describe it is similar to the kind of caskets that service members, if they're killed overseas in a war zone, service members come back over with the flag draped over those non-ornate sort of metal caskets. So we knew that she was buried in a Ziegler casket. We found an entry somewhere in the case file that it was believed that she was buried in the southwest portion of the cemetery. But again, the State Street Cemetery, which is on State Street in Hamden, it is no longer operational. It has no cemetery director, no cemetery association. If it wasn't for a few good Samaritans that take it upon themselves to go there and try to keep up with it as best they can, it would be completely overgrown, which is what we found when we took a ride to the State Street Cemetery just to get eyes on it. It was totally abandoned, and we had a portion of the cemetery that we believed she was buried in. So, we joined forces with a couple other people who really took a interest in the case. One was a retired New Haven police sergeant, Tony Grigo, and his colleague Amy White, and they had an interest in the case for other reasons, and they really wanted to find her and identify her for other reasons. So we just joined forces. Teamwork makes the dream work. We were honored and happy to utilize them. It was a force multiplier, and our next goal was to find somebody who had intimate knowledge of the cemetery. And again, there was no cemetery director or association, so it wasn't like you could just Google or look in the yellow pages to see, who to reach out to and who to call. But again, modern technology, and I'm going to keep using that phrase throughout this whole podcast. Facebook really solved that portion of it for us. We reached out to Facebook, one of the Hamden, Connecticut pages, and we pleaded for anybody that has any knowledge of anybody who used to run the State Street Cemetery, please reach out. And the Hamden community really came through. Family members and ex-acquaintances and people reached out and threw a name at us and a couple names at us. And we were able to, by the graces of God, reach out to a guy named Randy Guavin, who lives out of state now. And he agreed to meet us at the cemetery. He married into the Christensen family who used to run that cemetery, married Bob Christensen's daughter, who is, no longer, Bob Christensen is no longer with us. So, he's deceased, but he remembers as a young kid, this Jane Doe case. And he remembers Bob Christensen bringing him to the general area of the cemetery and saying, remember this area, because at some point down the road, investigators are going to be looking for this Jane Doe who we buried. So one morning he came and met us at the cemetery, and we were able to get to work.
But that's amazing, right? So hey, this guy said someday someone's going to come back for that. That's absolutely wild.
Yeah, and he didn't know exactly where she was because it had been so long ago since he had that conversation with his ex-father-in-law. But he knew the general area, and he knew how, when it was fully operational, how the rows were set up and how the burials were organized. So what he said to us was, number one, he requested a sounding rod, which is the rod that you would, throw into the ground, and tap something that's buried. He requested a sounding rod. He told myself and a colleague to go to the Hamden town clerk's office in Hamden, Connecticut. And he asked us to FaceTime him while he was still at the cemetery. And if he was confident that if we pulled burial records from the time preceding Jane Doe's burial, and he plotted out each burial record until we got to our Jane Doe, and then went a couple of burials further, then based on his knowledge of how the rows were set up, row A, B, and C, 1, 2, and 3, that he'd be able to plot out exactly where he believed Jane Doe was buried. So that's what we did. It took a little convincing once we got to the Hamden Town Hall clerk's office to allow us to sort of take over their office and get comfortable and pull all types of burial records in areas of the vault that hadn't been accessed for probably decades. But once we got there, we were able to find a hand-drawn map too that we didn't know existed of the State Street Cemetery, which, and I could send that to you at some point because it's really interesting to see. You really get a sense of how many people were buried at that cemetery. So that's what we did. We plotted out. He was there, plotting them out in real time, and he found what we thought to be Patricia's casket.
Right. Yeah, we're going to get into that one second. I just want to take a quick shout out to Flora and Pixie. Thank you very much for those super stickers. I really appreciate that. So there was also another clue that you had if you found the right casket too, right? Because the Emmy had saved her pelvic bone or saved a piece of it. So you knew if you found it, right?
Yeah. So, we were lucky enough to have a couple of clues. One, so in 1975 or 1976, when she was buried, most caskets were wooden, and unless they were really ornate caskets. But in the State Street Cemetery, and those burials go back to like the 1800s, most of the caskets in that cemetery were believed to have been wooden. So the ex-cemetery director made a good point. We're probably looking for a metal casket in a sea of wooden caskets. In addition to looking for a metal casket in a sea of wooden caskets, we knew that we got to our victim, our Jane Doe, if once we opened the casket, the deceased was missing a pubic bone, because that was one of the bones that the medical examiner retained for possible future analysis, which was pretty good forethought at the time. Come to find out, and I'm no expert in DNA, but I did learn one thing: the pubic bone is the worst bone to retain if you're looking for viable DNA to sequence later on down the road. But nobody knew that back then. We just appreciate the effort, and it was great. It was great forethought. But the pubic bone turned out to not yield much DNA, because that was one of the first things we tried to do. But we did know that if we got down to a casket, opened it up, and that person was missing a pubic bone, that was our victim. So, we got to work. We submitted a search warrant, even though there was no cemetery director, no association, really no expectation of privacy at that location, as the town of Hamden didn't even maintain it. But we wanted to kind of dot our I's and cross our T's. So
when in doubt, fill it out.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the biggest things we tell some of these young guys, because they're always looking for an exception to a search warrant. But it's just worth it to submit these search warrants. It may take time, but it's worth it. Which is what
I preach it all the time. I tell guys all the time, just get the warrant. I always tell people, if I had hair, I'd pull it out, because you see some of these other cases on TV where they got consent, and guys, you're dealing with a homicide. This is not like, a minor crime. Just get the warrant.
Yeah, exactly. So, so once we got through all the red tape and everything else, I think it's important to note that, the day of the exhumation, which was our first visit to the cemetery, and people don't realize how long these things take. Our first visit to the cemetery was in May of 2020, and our first exhumation wasn't until June of 2022. Um, and, we had to knock down a lot of the weeds and a lot of the overgrowth. So we had to get our public works involved. We had to reach out to the town of Hamden because we didn't want to tax any of their resources for our investigation. So we reached out to them and said, as long as you don't mind us coming into your town, our public works will take care of a lot of, we'll take care of everything. So they came and knocked down all of the overgrowth. On the day of, our public works came and dug in the area in which we thought she was buried. Our state's attorney's office met us out there. I mean, we had a pastor that met us out there because it was very important for us once we got down to her body, down to her casket, for the pastor to, give a little eulogy, and hold a vigil because, you know, and I don't know
Sacred
how
ground.
faithful, yeah, I don't know how
It's
faithful
sacred
you
ground.
are or how faithful your viewers are, but to us, disturbing somebody in something that has been resting for 48 years, I mean, that was really important for us to have some sort of faith-based pastor there with us, just to kind of set the tone. So we were grateful that he was there with us. We had the Hamden Police Department come, their detectives come, not to necessarily assist us with anything, but how many times in your career do you get to exhume a body in relation to a cold case homicide? So we told them to bring down some of their new investigators, and one of their rookie detectives came down just to kind of shadow us and take a look. So, we start digging, and we get down to a metal casket, and we believe that we found it. We're ecstatic, high fiving each other basically. And we open the casket and we realize that we have exhumed a 10-year-old boy, which, as you can imagine, was devastating to us, not only because we did not find the person that we were looking for, the victim that we were looking for, but we also disturbed the resting place of somebody else who had nothing to do with our investigation and who definitely did not deserve to get exhumed. So it was probably one of the worst feelings you could have as an investigator when you're trying to do this work, because you know you, you think you have all of this momentum, you plotted it out, you figured it out, you finally get to the day that you're going to make this exhumation, and you exhume a young child who was also, by the way, in an unmarked grave, which is devastating in itself. Who was this young boy? What was his story? What were the circumstances surrounding his death? Why did he end up in an unmarked grave himself? So um, that was a pretty terrible feeling the day of. Um, by the time we got down to the cemetery, and because of all the investigators that were on scene, it attracted the local media. So we had several news outlets that happened to be on scene while we were exhuming the casket. So I'll tell you, when you make a mistake and exhume the wrong body, it makes national news. When you come back 2 or 3 weeks later and exhume the right body, it hits about page 17. All right. So
Yeah.
uh, exhuming the wrong body made it to CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. I mean, it just went across the country and across the world that we exhumed the wrong body, which was frustrating. It was embarrassing, but I'll tell you what, it gave us the motivation to hit the ground running, to get a better location, and to come back and exhume the right body, which is what we did, but not before we came back with the an employee from the USDA enough to meet us at the location with a ground penetrating radar device, which was a game changer for sure.
Right, but I mean, you really had no map. You had no idea. This was basically just guessing. So, I mean, I've been there when the media is descending upon you. It's like you can't afford to make a mistake. But I mean, geez, you guys were working with. Very little information. Yep, you froze up on me, Joe. You got it?
Yeah, no, it was frustrating, but again, like, yep, I'm here. You got me?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, no, it was definitely frustrating for us. It was definitely frustrating for us, but it gave us the motivation to again hit the ground running. Like we were not going to stop there. So the Department of Agriculture came out, and their ground penetrating radar device showed that the area in which we thought was going to be a sea of wooden caskets and one or two metal caskets. Um, there was just a ton of metal caskets in that area. And not only that, if I could back up for 1 second, the reason why the State Street Cemetery is no longer in operation was because their practices were called into question over the years. And, it turned out that they were doing a lot of unethical things, which really came to light in the early 2000s, mid 2010s. So what we found was caskets stacked on top of each other. We found caskets not in rows, but just thrown in holes next to each other with no rhyme or reason. But I think the most concerning thing was that they were stacked two or three on top of each other, which is not what we were expecting. A lot of them were Ziegler caskets, which is exactly the type of casket we were looking for. And that suggested to us that towards the later part of them being in business and operational, they probably did a lot of business with towns and cities that were looking to bury maybe homeless people or transients or unidentified people. Who knows what the sort of deal was between the cemetery and some of these towns or cities. I'm not sure that there were burial records for each person that was buried in this cemetery. So,
Yeah.
it was some pretty unethical stuff. And once we got that ground penetrating radar device over the area that we thought she was buried in, we really saw what we were up against, and it wasn't pretty. Um, but we found a better location um, between the USDA and, believe it or not, a picture from media coverage and from 1995 or 96. It was an anniversary story, just a follow-up story many, many years later. And the ex-cemetery director, and he didn't even tell us that he took this picture. He didn't, must not have remembered, but he took a picture in the general area of where he thought she was buried. And we
Interesting.
were able, yeah, and it just sifting through some of the old case file again, because that's what you need to do when you hit a wall and you have nowhere else to go. Just get fresh eyes on some of the things that you've already looked at, because different things, it's kind of like when you watch a movie and you find a really funny part or a really interesting part in a movie. You watch the movie 5 times and something new always pops out at you. It's the same thing in investigative work. We were able to sift through some of the things we looked at 2 or 3 times before, and this just popped out at us. And we're like, you know what? Let's take a look at this area right there, exactly where he's standing on that fence post, that tree. It's still there. Let's start there based on something that was interesting from the ground penetrating radar device report. That's our location. Let's just go with it. And I don't want to say it was a shot in the dark, because we had a pretty good idea based off of where the wrong plot was. And it was only one plot over. But if it wasn't for that picture, we probably wouldn't have been as confident to start where we started. So in July of 2022, we came back, and again with the same amount of resources. We snuck in this time, and the media did not hear about it because we didn't want them to report twice that we were unable to find the right casket, because we didn't think there was going to be a third time. Because after submitting a second search warrant, we were scared that, we keep coming back to the same judge. Hey, we're going to try this time. We're going to try this
They
place.
don't get it. Yeah, they're not happy with that.
Yeah, they're not happy with that. So we were scared. I mean, we've pretty much thought this was our second and last time to be able to do this. So, but we were lucky enough to get down to the casket that we thought. It was severely damaged, over the years. Again, we're talking 48 years. The elements got inside of it. It was severely damaged. But there were two clues that led us to believe that we got down to the right casket. One was that the body that was inside was wrapped in an autopsy sheet. And the medical examiner, Michelle Clark from the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, was gracious enough to meet us there both times because, we weren't going to jump in and take DNA from
Right.
Jane Doe. We're not the experts. She is. So we are forever grateful that she was able and willing to do that for us. But she's like, this is a great sign. She's wrapped in the same type of autopsy blanket that the medical examiners used to use back then. And then she was able to get a closer look. And sure enough, the body inside that casket was in fact missing a pubic bone. It was at that moment that we knew we had located our Jane Doe. And it was just like a weight lifted off of our shoulders. I mean, we couldn't have been happier. We were, there were tears, there was celebration. And we were finally able to get, the pastor to give a little bit of a eulogy, and we held a quick vigil, and that, that was pretty much it for that day. Michelle Clark was able to get several samples of viable DNA, and including the femur, which is what we ultimately sent out to Colleen Fitzpatrick at Identifinders. So.
Right. And it doesn't take Colleen long and her team to find her identity, right?
No, and I'm grateful for Colleen too, because prior to if you back up a year or so, I had never even heard of Identifinders, never heard of her. She was referred to us because we presented this case at the New Haven, Connecticut State's Attorney's cold case meeting, and after the meeting, an investigator from Meriden, Connecticut came up to us and said, hey, have you ever heard of Identifinders? We worked with them on an unidentified child case who was found deceased in our city. And, she's a rock star. I mean, she is just so incredible. The work she does is amazing. She's one of the most knowledgeable people in the DNA field that I've ever spoken to. So he referred her to us, and I immediately reached out to her. And I'm thinking I'm never going to hear from her. I think I just cold emailed her from her website, from the form section of her website.
That's what I did. Yeah.
Yeah. And my God, she got back to me almost immediately, and she was interested in the case. She wanted to know what we knew about it and what we had planned for it. And I told her, and even the day of the exhumation, when we're in the hole and we have the casket, open, and Michelle Clark is basically ready to take whatever we need, I called Colleen, and she answered the phone right away. She was at a big conference on the West Coast. She stepped out. I could hear it in the background. She's like, hey, Joe, what's going on? I said, well, we're kind of in the middle of the exhibition. We finally got down to her. What do you want me to take? Because I'll take whatever you need. And she walked me through exactly what to take if we were able to take it. And, and that's what we did. So we ultimately went with a femur and a couple of fingers that we sent out to Colleen. We actually sent it out to a university in Canada, which presented its own challenges. It's funny because when you send something through FedEx, one of the questions on it is, are you sending human remains? And 99.9% of the time, people probably check off no. But in this case, we checked off yes, which set off a bunch of red flags phone starts ringing. Had to work through some red tape. Once they got on the on the phone with a manager, they were able to say that we were law enforcement and we were sending body parts for DNA testing out to Canada. But they were like, don't be surprised if this gets held up at the border.
Customs. Yeah.
Yeah, which it did for a little while, but it was able to make its way through. And after that, it's just hurry up and wait. This was in July of 2022 when we sent all that stuff out to Lakehead University in Canada, and we didn't hear anything at all besides just a couple of follow-up. There's different steps, right, when you're going to go and sequence something, through DNA, and it has to pass each step in order to get to the next step. So like there's a quality control phase, and then there's a couple of other phases after that. So every time you see that there's an email from Colleen or from somebody from Identifinders, you just hope that the email is good news, that it has passed step one and is moving on to step two. Because if it fails anything, say it fails the first, like a quality control check or test, then it doesn't move on to the next steps. You're dead in the water, So we were lucky enough to keep on getting this correspondence from her, and it passed, and it's on to the next step, and it's on to the next phase. But we didn't hear much until April of 2023, and it was just started off as a normal day, just like any other day. And I was on the phone with somebody else, and I see that Identifinders was calling my desk line, and I couldn't pick it up at that moment. But Linda Doyle from Identifinders left a message, and you could just hear it in her voice. Joe, you got to call me back immediately. We have identified your Jane Doe. The story is amazing. Please call me back as soon as you get this. And my heart dropped. It was, just a moment that I'll never forget. When I called her, she's like, "You're never going to believe this. We identified her almost immediately. Once we started to put all the pieces together, because there's a lot of background work and things that you have to do in order, to really lock in who this person was. But sure enough, she's like, her name is Patricia Newsome. She is a missing person. She told me her whole story. She told me that her sister, Marianne, made it her life's mission to find her, but nobody was ever looking for her prior to 2021. So throughout this whole time, the 70s, 80s, the 90s, when investigators were trying to find some sort of family member, her family was not looking for her back. So it was virtually impossible to find Marianne prior to 2021, which is when Marianne uploaded her DNA to GEDmatch, and that's where things started to change.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, and the key to this is her sister Mariana, because I was reading about her, getting her DNA, putting it into the system. She was also using NamUs, right, the National Missing Unidentified Person System, which was pretty new back when you was started doing this stuff too. It was only a few years old, I think. So it's interesting, like you said, how all the technology, the new site, the new computer programs, and everything else has come together. And now Connecticut was the forefront of the missing persons. I helped find the missing with the case. It was Bobby. Is it? I forget the name of it, but you guys had that case now.
Yeah, and Marianne hadn't heard about our case, but she heard about the Lady of the Dunes case, which is out in the Cape Cod area. And she thought, because her family had spent some time in Cape Cod and stuff, she thought that the Lady of the Dunes case, which is also a very interesting case, might have been her sister Patricia. So because she was really, familiar with the Lady of the Dunes Jane Doe case, that's what really prompted her to upload her DNA into GEDmatch, because she thought possibly the Lady of the Dunes was her sister Patricia. And She had never done anything like that before. She had never heard of it, but somebody talked her into doing it. And she was at the point where, you can't lose, it's worth it. You have faith that at some point somebody's going to come forward with information related to your missing sister. So she just decided to go ahead and upload her DNA, thinking that it was possibly a match with the Lady of the Dunes. Unfortunately, though, the Lady of the Dunes case was solved and it wasn't her sister, but she never gave up hope. So throughout this time, excuse me, she contributed to different podcasts. She started a Find Patricia Newsome Facebook page, which was dedicated to anybody that had any information. Maybe you went to school with Patricia. Maybe you knew her growing up. So she, started a Facebook page. And when, Linda called me from Identifinders and told me who she was, I immediately took to Facebook. I immediately found these podcasts. And do you know the feeling I had listening and doing my research on this case and knowing that in a matter of 24 or 48 hours, I'm going to be calling Marianne and I'm going to change her whole entire life. She is not expecting me in a day or two from now to call her and tell her that I have identified her sister. And, it took everything in me not to reach out to Marianne immediately, but we wanted to get our ducks in a row initially, and it didn't work out logistically because it was more important for us to get that information to Marianne as fast as possible. But we initially were going to hop on a plane and go to Tennessee to where Marianne lived and literally knock on her door and tell her this information in person. But logistically, like I said, it was just more important for us to get that information to her immediately. So we reached out to a agency in Tennessee where she lived. And lucky for us, I was able to get on the phone with a detective who had intimate knowledge of Marianne and of her sister Patricia, because he was the one who facilitated her to upload her DNA into GEDmatch. So, I thought I was going to call a big agency in Tennessee and they were going to give me the runaround and I was going to have to explain who I am. And I need to get in touch with her immediately because I just identified her sister. But the detective that got on the phone initially was totally familiar with her in the case. So he said, I'm going to drive with you right now. She doesn't live too far away. I'm going to drive with you on the phone and you could tell her yourself as soon as I get there. So, chatted small talk for about 5 minutes. The detective said, I'm pulling up right now. You hear him walk up to the door. Marianne comes to the door. He says, Marianne, I think you're going to want to take this phone call. I have Captain Murgo on the phone. He's a captain in East Haven, Connecticut, and he has some very important news to tell you. And she gets on the phone, and I would love to have a recording of how I said it because I was so emotional, and I didn't think I was going to be, but my goodness, I could not get the words out without crying my eyes out, telling her that, Marianne, your search for your sister has finally come to an end. We have identified her. Unfortunately, I have the bad news of telling you that she was a Jane Doe homicide victim in the town of East Haven, Connecticut on August 16th, 1975. But your search for your sister is over. We have identified her. We cannot wait to meet you. Can you come up here as soon as possible so we can take you to her resting place? And there wasn't a dry eye in the room. I was in my chief's office with the deputy chief, the chief, and a detective lieutenant. All of us were crying like babies. Marianne was crying on the other end like a baby. I mean, it was just a pinnacle moment in all of our careers, a moment that, I don't think any of us will ever forget. But then it was back to work because we had to get her up here immediately. So within the week, she drove up from Tennessee to Connecticut, and that was it. We met her for the first time, and we brought her to the State Street Cemetery where her sister rests. And Yeah, it's just a moment we'll never forget.
Yeah, great story. Well, if you ever retire from the police department, you can always tell stories because you have a knack for it. you,
I appreciate it.
yeah,
Yeah,
you
this is
kept
an easy
me.
one. This is an easy one to tell, just because it's just a moment in a slice in time that we'll never forget, and later on that day, she stood with us in on the front lobby of the East Haven Town Hall, and we made the announcement to the world that we finally identified our Jane Doe as Patricia Newsome, and she stood right next to us during the whole thing.
Did you get the cable news outreach on that for that presser, or was that
Yeah, no, that was yeah, they made a pretty big deal. They made a pretty big
good?
deal out of that one because and there were a bunch that followed, but for the most part in our area, utilizing that DNA and solving and identifying these cold cases, that was we were one of the earlier ones. And that sort of set off a lot of these other agencies to reaching out to companies like Identifinders to help with their Jane Does. And there's 4 or 5 in the area in the following months that identified theirs too. So, and a lot of them referenced our case as sort of a catalyst to give them the motivation to go do it with theirs. And so it was just really rewarding. It was just a really rewarding moment, and we're happy to possibly play a part in closure for some other families as well.
Yeah, no, it's a great story. You guys did a great job. Tina has a question. I don't know if you can answer. Is it any other people from that cemetery identified? Did you have it?
So
Is there any
great,
other
yeah,
open cases going with that?
great question. So no, the short answer is no. We were mission driven to find the casket that we were looking for. But what was interesting, and I kind of ran this by in jest, ran it by the Hamden deputy chief. There's a lot of
Which
bodies
I'm
in that.
sure it
There's a
didn't
lot
make
of
you
bodies.
popular.
There's a lot of bodies in that cemetery that are in unmarked graves, and who knows what the circumstances are surrounding those other caskets that are buried. But the GPR report showed a lot of caskets, all in unmarked graves. So, it's pretty sad. And again, you never know the circumstances. Maybe people didn't have the money or the means to give a proper burial or to give a burial or at all, or get headstones down the future. Maybe it was something that was put off and it was always meant to happen, and time got away from people and they were never able to bring headstones there. But no, a lot of caskets, a lot of bodies. None besides Patricia were identified, including that 10-year-old boy. We're estimating him to be 10 years old, but including that boy, I would love to know the circumstances behind his death and why he was in that cemetery in an unmarked grave too. So interesting.
Yeah, no, that's a story here. Sinead had a question earlier. What was the cause of death for Patricia? Did they ever announce that?
Yeah, so the cause of death was asphyxiation due to smothering or strangulation. We're leaning towards smothering because there were no injuries to the neck area. And after learning a little bit about the case and potentially some of the circumstances surrounding her death, we believe that she was probably smothered in some way. Um, yeah.
Right, or just yeah, from the gag into that whole thing. Billy Smolinski was the name of the law that Connecticut passed about help find the missing act. It was actually a federal case, but it came to me as we were talking. I'm just going through to see if there was any other questions. Uh, Captain, this was a fantastic story. I appreciate that you spent the time with us. That hour flew by. As I said, you're a
Yeah,
great story. You're a great storyteller. We hope
I
to have you
appreciate it.
back when you actually solve this case. We didn't want to get into the weeds with suspects and stuff like that because it's still an active homicide investigation. I know some people had asked about that, but we can't get into those things. But when you solve this case, you got to come back on here so we can talk about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'd be honored to. Thank you all so much for reaching out. And again, Colleen, thank you so much for referring me to you because this was it was amazing. So I appreciate it. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
it was a lot of fun, and I'm going to post. If you didn't see the interview I did with Colleen, everybody. I'm going to post it at the end of this video. It'll come up as a card. You could click on it right after this video. You can watch onto that. Cap, you hang on one second. We're going to say goodbye to everybody else, guys. Thanks for hanging out with us tonight, and we'll see you soon. It's this Thursday morning, roll call, 8 a.m. Take care, guys.
Thanks, Sarge.